The woods of northern Alabama have a silence that feels alive, thick, breathing, and aware of every step that disturbs it. Locals call it the Harlow stillness, a quiet so heavy it can make your ears ring. Deep inside those trees, beyond the reach of cell service or sunlight, once stood a cabin that no map ever marked. It was the kind of place you didn't stumble upon by accident, and if you did, you didn't speak of it afterward. The first to break that rule was a social worker from Montgomery. She went looking for a family no one had seen in years, a family that lived by their own laws. She never came back. When her car was found, doors open and engine cold, the forest had already swallowed her footprints. But something else surfaced instead: bones, journals, and the whispers of a man who called himself the Keeper of Blood. His name was Elijah Harlow. To some, he was a ghost story parents told their children to keep them out of the woods. To others, he was real, a patriarch who built his own kingdom from flesh and fear. In that cabin, the lines between mother, daughter, and sister blurred until they no longer existed. Every birth echoed his sin. Every cry in the night was his legacy. Now, decades later, the earth still trembles when the wind moves through those trees. Some say you can hear a baby crying, though no one lives there anymore. Others swear they've seen a figure watching from the tree line, a man with eyes too hollow to be human. But one thing is certain: whatever happened in that house, it was never buried deep enough. The disappearance began like a whisper, one that few in town took seriously at first. The woman who went missing wasn't a stranger. Her name was Lydia Cole a state social worker known for her persistence, the kind that made enemies in quiet places. Her last assignment took her beyond the paved roads of northern Alabama, into an area locals called Harlow Hollow a stretch of dense forest known for swallowing sound and secrets alike. She had been sent there to check on an unregistered family reportedly living off the grid, a clan that hadn't appeared in census records for more than 20 years. The report was routine, another welfare visit, but the case file contained something that made her pause. Every address listed for the family led to nowhere. The last clue was a faded photograph of a wooden cabin surrounded by pine trees, dated sometime in the late 1970s. On the morning of her disappearance, Lydia left a voicemail for her supervisor, saying she had finally found the road that doesn't want to be found. That was the last anyone ever heard from her. When her car was discovered 2 days later, it sat parked on a dirt trail half swallowed by weeds, the driver's door ajar, keys still dangling in the ignition. Her shoes were neatly placed beside the car, as if she had removed them before walking into the woods. The nearby ground showed no signs of struggle, only footprints that vanished after a few yards, ending where the forest thickened into a wall of tangled vines and thorns. Search parties were dispatched, dogs brought in, drones flown overhead, yet the forest seemed to shift with every search. Paths led nowhere, and even the trained rescue teams admitted they lost their sense of direction inside those woods. One deputy claimed his compass spun in circles, another swore he heard humming beneath the ground. What made the case stranger was what they found during the third day of the search: an old sign nailed to a tree that read **private, Harlow family property ***. The wood was splintered and the name carved deep as if someone wanted it to last forever. Behind that tree, the scent of something rotten drifted through the air. By the end of the week, the search was called off. The official report listed Lydia Cole as missing, presumed dead. But her colleagues said she had sent one final text before her phone went dark, a message with no coordinates, no details, only 5 words, *they're not supposed to exist. After that, every mention of the Harlow family vanished from state records, as though someone had erased them by hand. Yet locals still whisper that Lydia found the house and that the woods decided she shouldn't leave. Weeks after Lydia Cole's disappearance, a hunter from a nearby town stumbled upon something that shouldn't have been there. He'd gone deeper into the forest than usual, chasing a wounded deer, when his dog began to whine and back away from a patch of overgrown brush. Behind the thorned vines and collapsed trees lay the faint outline of a structure not quite visible until he tore through the tangle and saw it, an old cabin sunken into the earth as if the forest had been trying to bury it. The windows were covered with boards from the inside, and what remained of the roof sagged under the weight of moss and rot. It didn't look abandoned, it looked hidden. The hunter left without entering, too uneasy to stay, but word of the discovery reached the sheriff's office by nightfall. When investigators returned with him the next morning, the air around the cabin carried an unnatural stillness. Every sound, birds, wind, insects, seemed to fade the closer they got. The door creaked open with the first push, releasing a wave of damp air that smelled like earth and decay. Inside, the house appeared frozen in time. Plates still sat on the table, food long turned to dust, and a rocking chair faced a corner of the room where no one had sat for decades. Family photographs covered the walls, but all the faces had been scratched out except for one, a tall man with a sharp stare and a hand resting on the shoulder of a little girl. No one recognized the man, but the name carved into the bottom of the frame read ***EH.****. Outside the cabin, the ground was uneven, pocked with depressions that looked disturbingly like graves. There were no markers, only piles of stones arranged with unsettling precision. Scattered between them were the remnants of toys, a cracked porcelain doll, a rusted tricycle, a teddy bear missing its head. Farther back, behind the house, investigators found the remnants of several rusted cars partially consumed by the soil, their license plates long unreadable. Each vehicle had been stripped of seats and handles, as if someone had deliberately made them useless for escape. When the property was mapped, an eerie discovery emerged. The cabin and its surroundings did not appear on any official record. No land deed, no property tax, not even an aerial image showed evidence of its existence. It was as if the land itself had erased it. The sheriff's report was brief and cautious, noting only that an unregistered dwelling had been found in the forest. But the deputy who led the search confided to a reporter months later that inside the cabin, behind a rotting curtain, they had found a child's handprint pressed into the wall, too fresh to belong to anyone buried there. When the cabin and the surrounding property were finally examined by forensic teams, the investigation began to reveal something far more disturbing than an abandoned home. The graves around the site were quietly exhumed, each containing remains in various states of decay. At first, it appeared to be a family burial ground, perhaps generations who had lived and died in isolation. But when the forensic results returned, the bloodlines told a story that defied all logic. Every skeleton, from infant to adult, shared nearly identical DNA. It wasn't just the mark of kinship, it was the signature of repetition, the same genes folding inward, generation after generation, until identity itself began to blur. The investigators could not find a single genetic outlier among them. It was as if one bloodline had been copied and pasted across decades. The revelation came quietly, tucked inside a sealed report labeled internal use only. Genetic testing confirmed that several of the bodies could not be distinguished by parental lineage. The supposed father was also genetically compatible as the son, the brother, and in some cases, even the uncle. It was impossible to trace a clean line of descent. The same mitochondrial pattern appeared again and again, binding the family together in a biological labyrinth. The scientists tasked with interpreting the data hesitated to give it a name, but one phrase circulated through the lab in uneasy whispers, *closed lineage breeding. For the authorities, the findings raised more questions than they answered. How had this family survived for so long without detection? How had no birth certificates, no medical records, no school enrollments ever surfaced? Yet in rural Alabama, where some families lived far beyond the reach of modern systems, it wasn't unheard of for generations to exist undocumented. Still, the extremity of this case was unlike anything they'd seen. The degree of genetic overlap pointed to at least 4 generations of inbreeding, all stemming from a single male ancestor whose DNA matched the initials carved into the cabin photographs EH. Rumors spread quickly after fragments of the report leaked. Locals whispered that Elijah Harlow had been obsessed with preserving pure blood, claiming his family carried divine ancestry. He forbade marriage outside the household and punished anyone who spoke of leaving. Over time, the boundaries between relationships dissolved, mother became wife, sister became daughter, and lineage turned into a loop. The children born under his rule never left the property, and those who tried were never seen again. By the time authorities pieced together the genetic map, the name Harlow had become synonymous with something unholy, something too entangled in its own blood to ever escape the curse it carried. The name Elijah Harlow surfaced slowly, whispered first by old residents of nearby towns who claimed to remember him as a quiet man with unsettling eyes. He had been seen only a handful of times, usually at the edge of town, trading pelts and homemade tools for supplies before vanishing back into the woods. Those who met him described a man who spoke little, but when he did, his words carried a conviction that made people uneasy. He often spoke about purity, about keeping one's blood untainted by the sins of the outside world. To the locals, it sounded like madness, but to Elijah, it was a calling, one he believed had been given to him by God himself. He built his life on isolation, creating a world that existed entirely under his control, one where the rules of morality, law, and nature bent to his will. According to the few surviving records, Elijah had inherited the land from his grandfather, who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The property stretched deep into the forest, untouched and shielded by miles of wilderness. Elijah began cutting off all contact with the town after his mother's death, refusing medical help, refusing visitors, and eventually forbidding any of his kin from leaving the land. What began as a lifestyle of self-reliance turned into complete isolation, enforced by fear and superstition. He told his family that the outside world was cursed, that those who stepped beyond the trees would be consumed by fire or madness. With every passing year, his voice became law, and his beliefs became doctrine. Witnesses who recalled him during his early years said he carried a Bible worn to shreds, though much of it had been rewritten in his own hand. His teachings twisted familiar verses into warnings, claiming that the blood must remain within the chosen. Over time, this belief took root in the minds of those trapped with him, passed down as sacred truth. Children grew up without ever knowing other faces, learning that obedience was salvation and disobedience meant death. The deeper investigators dug into the Harlow name, the more it became clear that Elijah had ruled his family through terror disguised as divine order. Those who questioned him were said to have disappeared into the forest, their names scratched off the family records. Inside the cabin, one photograph showed him standing before his kin, tall and solemn, his expression fixed in quiet authority. Beneath the image, a phrase was carved into the wood, *, what is born here stays here. *, it was not a warning to outsiders but a decree to his bloodline, a rule that chained every soul in that house to his will. The deeper investigators delved into the history of the Harlow family, the more grotesque the truth began to surface. Through a combination of surviving journals, whispered confessions from neighboring towns, and traces of old DNA records, they pieced together the story of Elijah Harlow's reign over his household. It was said that within the cabin's walls, family did not exist in the way the world understood it. Boundaries dissolved until bloodlines tangled beyond comprehension, and Elijah stood at the center of it all, the self-proclaimed patriarch of a world he had molded in his own image. The truth that emerged was nearly impossible to speak aloud. Elijah had fathered children with his own mother, his sister, and later with his own daughter, all under the same roof, within the same house that the woods had long tried to erase. Those who knew the Harlows during the earliest years described a strange quiet around their home. Neighbors sometimes caught glimpses of women who looked hauntingly alike, as though each generation was merely a reflection of the last. Children with pale, glassy eyes would appear at the tree line, watching silently before retreating back into the shadows. When asked who they were, they would only say we're family, as if that answered everything. The local preacher once tried to visit, hoping to bring Elijah back to the church, but he returned pale and trembling, refusing to speak of what he had seen inside. Soon after, he left town entirely. In one of the few surviving pieces of writing attributed to Elijah, a weathered notebook found in the ashes of a burned-out room, his words revealed his twisted reasoning. He claimed that sin entered blood through outsiders, that only those of the same flesh could remain pure. He wrote of a divine purpose of being chosen to rebuild humanity untainted by the world's corruption. His mother, referred to only as the first, was described as the vessel through which his sacred bloodline began. His sister followed, then his daughter, each seen not as kin but as extensions of himself. He wrote, *, the family must remain one body, one breath, one seed. *. No one could say how many children were born in that house or how many died. Some were buried beneath the property, others vanished without trace. The most disturbing part of the investigation revealed that even the youngest generation showed unmistakable genetic signs of being both child and sibling to one another. Within the same crumbling walls, mother, daughter, and sister lived and bore the same man's name. And when the forest finally took the house, it was said to be merciful, as if nature itself was trying to cleanse what human hands had defiled. The discovery of the mother's journal changed everything. It was found hidden beneath a loose floorboard in what had once been the main bedroom, wrapped in layers of cloth so old that it crumbled when touched. The journal belonged to Martha Harlow Elijah's mother, the woman he referred to in his writings as the first. Its pages were brittle, written in ink that had faded to a rusty brown, but the words remained legible enough to reveal the life of a woman trapped in a nightmare disguised as devotion. She wrote in fragmented sentences, as if afraid someone might find and punish her for even thinking the truth. The first pages described a time before Elijah's rule, when the cabin was simply a family home, when laughter still existed between the walls. But that warmth disappeared the moment Elijah began to speak of the cleansing. He claimed he had seen visions, that the Lord spoke to him through dreams and demanded that their blood remain untouched by the outside world. The journal detailed how Elijah's control grew, not suddenly but slowly, like roots twisting beneath the floor. He forbade visitors, burned the family's letters, and isolated each member from one another until he was their only connection to reality. Martha wrote of the fear she felt, the way Elijah's gaze followed her, the way his voice shifted from loving to commanding, how he began calling her chosen instead of mother. There were passages written through tears, describing the night she could no longer refuse him. She spoke of shame, of praying for forgiveness, and of believing that maybe she had sinned long before he ever touched her. The words trembled across the page, written as if she was confessing to the walls instead of the world. As the entries continued, her tone changed from fear to resignation. She began to justify his actions, repeating his phrases as though they were prayers. She wrote that their suffering was proof of their purity, that every child born within the family carried divine light. Yet between the lines, there were moments of lucidity, desperate cries from a woman who knew she was losing herself. One passage stood out among the rest, smeared with dirt and tears. He says the world outside is dying, but I think it's us. I think it's us that's dying, one child at a time. The final entries were barely coherent, the handwriting shaky, as if written in darkness. The last page ended with no words, only a handprint in dried blood. Investigators concluded she had been documenting years of manipulation and abuse under the weight of religious delusion. But for many who read it, the journal was more than evidence, it was a voice reaching out from a grave, warning what happens when fear and faith become one. The more investigators studied the Harlow property, the more they began to realize that the family's story didn't exist in isolation. Strange events in the nearby town and surrounding farmland appeared to align with moments in the Harlow lineage: births, deaths, disappearances. Every generation seemed to leave behind a trail of misfortune that reached far beyond the woods. Local archives revealed a chilling pattern. Every few years, around the same time one of Elijah's descendants was born or buried, a tragedy would occur in the nearby community. Fires would break out in barns for no reason, livestock would vanish overnight, or entire wells would turn black and undrinkable. People called them coincidences at first, but the pattern was too exact, too deliberate, as if something unseen was echoing through time. Old newspaper clippings told stories of families who claimed to hear cries at night coming from the forest, especially when the moon was full. Dogs would howl until dawn, and cattle would refuse to go near the northern ridge where the Harlow land began. An elderly farmer who had lived through 3 generations swore that every time a new Harlow child was born, a storm would follow, the kind that tore through roofs and split trees as though the heavens themselves were rejecting the life that had just entered the world. The townspeople began to treat the Harlow name like a curse, something you never spoke aloud after dark. The correlation between the family's bloodline and these local tragedies was eventually documented in an internal police file labeled Temporal Disturbances, Harlow Territory. It wasn't an official investigation, more of a whispered collection of notes from deputies who had grown up with the folklore. One of them, a man named Deputy Warren, claimed that every time they found a new grave near the cabin, something in town would die too: a person, an animal, sometimes even an entire crop. He described it as if life itself was paying a debt for whatever sins had been committed on that land. When scientists later examined soil samples from around the graves, they discovered an unusual chemical imbalance, a high concentration of phosphorus and traces of human bone mixed deep within the earth. It suggested that the ground had been disturbed many times over, not just for burial but for something ritualistic. Some speculated that Elijah or his descendants had buried family members as offerings, believing their deaths would protect the bloodline or cleanse it from impurity. Whether by superstition, curse, or simple coincidence, every time the Harlow name marked a new generation, something nearby seemed to suffer. To those who still lived in the shadow of Harlow Hollow, it felt as though the land itself carried the family's corruption, feeding on it, breathing it, and never letting it die. When investigators finally gained permission to excavate beneath the Harlow cabin, they expected to find evidence of burial or storage, perhaps remnants of food cellars or animal remains. What they uncovered instead left even the most seasoned officers silent. Beneath a layer of rotted floorboards and crumbling stone was a trapdoor sealed with rusted bolts and a chain. It took nearly 2 hours to pry open, and when it did, a wave of damp, stagnant air rolled out, heavy with the scent of mildew and something faintly metallic. A narrow staircase led downward into darkness, carved directly into the earth, the walls lined with rotting boards that had absorbed decades of moisture. At the bottom of the stairs, flashlights revealed a room that didn't appear in any layout of the house, a space that had been deliberately hidden from anyone above. The room was small, circular, and lined entirely with mirrors. Most were cracked, but they reflected light in fractured shards that seemed to move even when the investigators stood still. Along the dirt floor lay scattered bones, both human and animal, arranged in patterns that no one could immediately explain. Some were tied together with twine, others painted with faded streaks of white chalk. At the center of the room stood a table covered in melted candle wax and old photographs. Each photograph showed a member of the Harlow family, but almost every face had been violently defaced with scratches, burns, or what appeared to be claw marks. Only one face remained untouched, Elijah Harlow's. His image appeared again and again, in different poses and different years, but always the same stare, cold, proud, and unmoving. The investigators noted that the room seemed to have no true exit other than the narrow stairs leading up. The air inside felt thick, charged, and unnaturally cold. Even the camera batteries drained faster than normal, forcing them to work by flashlight. Written on one of the walls in dark, dried residue were the words *, he watches through the glass. *, some believed it referred to Elijah himself, a warning or perhaps a declaration. Others thought it meant something else entirely, that the mirrors had been used for ritualistic purposes, perhaps to contact what Elijah believed was divine. Among the evidence collected was a cracked locket found near the table, containing strands of hair belonging to 3 different people, all genetically related. The discovery of this underground chamber transformed the case from one of isolation and inbreeding into something darker, something almost ceremonial. It suggested that Elijah's rule was not only physical but spiritual, that he had bound his family to a belief so consuming that it left its mark not just on their minds, but on the very walls that enclosed them. Months after the cabin's discovery, when the investigation had begun to fade from public attention, a call came from a logging crew clearing part of the forest bordering Harlow Hollow. One of the workers claimed to have seen movement, a pale figure darting between the trees. At first, they thought it was a wild animal, but then they heard a sound that chilled them, a human voice humming softly, a tune that rose and fell like a lullaby. When deputies arrived to investigate, they found footprints, small, bare, and erratic, leading deep into the underbrush. The trail ended at the mouth of a dried creek bed, where they discovered a young woman crouched among the reeds, her body caked in dirt, her hair matted into thick ropes. She didn't run when they approached, she simply looked up, eyes wide and unblinking, her lips moving without sound. She appeared to be around 17, though malnourishment made her look far younger. At the hospital, she refused to speak for days. Doctors said her muscles were underdeveloped, her skin bore signs of prolonged sun deprivation, and her hands were calloused as though she had crawled rather than walked for much of her life. When investigators attempted to identify her, no records surfaced. No missing persons report matched her face, no birth certificate existed. Yet when DNA tests were conducted, The results stunned everyone involved. Her genetic makeup contained markers linking her to 3 distinct maternal lines within the Harlow family. Biologically, she was both daughter, sister, and niece to individuals already confirmed dead in the graves around the cabin. It was as though 3 generations of blood had merged in one person, a living consequence of Elijah's obsession with preserving purity. Psychologists who interviewed her described her as eerily calm, speaking in a voice almost childlike. She referred to herself only as Eve, though no one knew if that name had been given to her or chosen by her. When asked about her family, she repeated fragments of what sounded like scripture. The blood stays clean. The father never dies. She flinched at the sight of mirrors and covered her ears whenever anyone mentioned the cabin. One nurse swore she woke one night to find the girl standing beside her bed, staring out the window toward the woods, whispering, "He's still there." Authorities debated whether she had escaped the cabin or been left behind intentionally. Her survival raised more questions than answers: how she had lived alone for so long, what she had eaten, and most of all, why she bore no fear of the forest that had swallowed her family. Some believed she was the last remnant of the Harlow bloodline, others whispered she wasn't alone when they found her, that something unseen had been watching from the trees, waiting for her to return home. When the cleanup of the Harlow property began, the goal was simple: to remove what remained of the cabin and restore the land to silence. The state wanted to erase the place from memory, to let the forest reclaim what man had corrupted. But as demolition crews started digging through the wreckage, their machinery struck something solid beneath the foundations: not stone, not root, but wood. Beneath the cabin's floor lay a concealed tunnel, its entrance packed with dirt and debris. The workers stopped immediately, and investigators returned to the site for one final inspection. When they cleared the passage and shined their flashlights inside, they saw a narrow corridor stretching deep into the earth, supported by hand-cut beams blackened with age. The air that drifted from below was colder than the October wind, carrying a smell of soil and rot that had been trapped for decades. The tunnel twisted and branched, leading into several small chambers, each lined with crude carvings on the walls, crosses, spirals, and words written in what appeared to be ash. The deeper they went, the stranger the markings became. Phrases like "he breathes beneath us" and "the blood returns to dust" appeared repeatedly, carved by the same unsteady hand. In the last chamber, where the tunnel came to a dead end, they found a wooden box buried halfway in the dirt. Inside was a body, preserved by the cool, dry earth. It was the unmistakable remains of a man, tall even in death, with a long coat still clinging to the bone. A brass pendant hung around his neck, engraved with the initials *******. The DNA confirmed what everyone already feared: the body belonged to Elijah Harlow. But the details of his burial made no sense. There were no signs of ritual or preparation, no coffin, no markings of respect. The position of the skeleton suggested struggle: hands pressed against the wooden lid, fingers broken and bent as though clawing for air. Forensic experts concluded that Elijah had been buried alive. Whether his family turned on him or he had sealed himself beneath the earth to escape something he believed in, no one could say. Around his remains were scattered personal items: a rusted Bible, the remains of melted candles, and what appeared to be children's teeth strung together on twine. When the discovery was made public, locals said the forest had finally taken back what it was owed. Some believed his family had revolted, that generations of fear had finally erupted into vengeance. Others whispered that Elijah had not died at all, that he had simply gone deeper, that his spirit still lingered below the soil, watching through the roots. After his body was removed, workers refused to return to the site. The tunnel was sealed with concrete, but the ground above it never settled right again. Those who live nearby say that when the night wind passes through Harlow Hollow, it carries a hollow sound, like a man breathing under the earth.